Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into the book of Exodus. It's such a core story, foundational for so much.
Absolutely. It's packed with drama, big questions, huge events. We know lots of you are curious about getting beneath the surface.
Definitely. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a mix of stuff.
Yeah, we're looking at theological takes, what biblical scholars are saying, archaeological findings or the lack thereof sometimes, and even some pretty interesting scientific ideas about things like the plagues.
Right. Our plan is basically to sift through all that, pull out the key insights, and tackle those big questions about Exodus.
And hopefully do it in a way that's clear and engaging, without getting too bogged down in overly academic language.
Exactly. Okay, let's dive right in. First up, the big one. Who actually wrote Exodus?
Well, the traditional view, the one deeply rooted in faith, is Moses, author of the whole Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
And there's backing for that elsewhere, isn't there?
Like in Mark's Gospel, chapter 7, verse 10, Jesus seems to acknowledge Moses as the lawgiver, which many take as confirmation.
So that sounds like a solid traditional case.
It definitely holds a lot of weight for many. And, within Exodus itself, you have God telling Moses, write this down, commands to record things.
Okay.
So there's an indirect argument there. But the book itself never actually says, I, Moses, wrote this whole thing.
Ah, okay. And when scholars look closely...
That's where it gets more complicated. They find, passages that seem to talk about things after Moses' time, or details that don't quite mesh with his known biography from other parts of the Bible.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's led to different theories trying to bridge that gap, like essential Mosaic authorship.
What's that exactly?
The idea that maybe Moses wrote the core parts, the foundational stuff, and then later writers or editors built on that foundation compiled his teachings.
Kind of a middle ground.
Sort of, yeah. But the main view in modern biblical scholarship, it really goes further.
How so?
Well, the consensus now is generally that Exodus, like the rest of the Pentateuch, is probably a composite work.
Meaning?
Meaning layers of material, different literary strands, likely put together by multiple authors and editors over a fair amount of time. So pitting it all on Moses alone looks pretty implausible to most scholars today.
Okay, so authorship is complex. Let's shift to the timeline. When did all this supposedly happen? I know the dating is a huge debate.
Oh, absolutely. The Great Date debate, as it's sometimes called. You basically have two main camps. An early date, maybe around 1446 BC.
Okay.
And a later date, more like 1260 BC.
And what's the reasoning behind those specific dates?
Well, the early date crew often points to 1 Kings 6.1. It says Solomon started his temple 480 years after the Exodus. Take that literally.
And you land back in the mid-15th century BC, 1446.
Exactly. But those favoring the later date, they often see that 480 years as maybe symbolic, like perhaps 12 generations, with each generation being, say, 40 years. That's a common biblical pattern. And that calculation gets you closer to the 13th century BC, around 1260.
Right. And the actual writing of the book itself, when would that fit in?
Well, regardless of which date you lean towards for the event, the writing of Exodus is often thought to have happened during that 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness.
That makes sense. Gives them time to process and record it all.
Exactly. It's a long, detailed narrative. It would take time.
Okay, so we have possible time frames for the event and the writing. But one thing that always strikes me is that Pharaoh, the main bad guy, is never named. Doesn't that make it harder to pin down historically?
It definitely does. It's a major hurdle for historians trying to connect the story to known Egyptian history and specific rulers.
So you can't just say, oh, it was Ramses II or someone specific based on the text alone.
Not definitively, no. People try to match details like building projects mentioned to certain reigns, but without a name, it's always going to involve some guesswork and interpretation.
Yeah.
Leads to a lot of debate, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I bet. And what about archaeology? Does the evidence on the ground in Egypt or Sinai help clear things up?
Ah, archaeology. This is where things get really tricky and, frankly, challenging for the traditional view.
How so?
Well, despite tons of archaeological work in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, there just hasn't been any direct, large-scale evidence found that confirms, a huge population of Israelites living in Egypt and then suddenly leaving en masse.
So no remains of massive slave camps or evidence of a sudden, widespread departure?
Not in the way a biblical narrative seems to imply, no. That's the current archaeological consensus.
And in the Sinai Desert, where they supposedly wandered for 40 years.
Similar situation, there's just a lack of widespread archaeological evidence for the kind of large, long-term encampments that a massive group, millions perhaps, would have left behind during that specific time frame.
Mm.
And some archaeologists also point out that when the Israelites do appear in the land of Canaan later, their early material culture looks very, very similar to the existing Canaanite culture.
Not like something completely distinct brought in from Egypt.
Right. It seems more like an indigenous development, or at least heavily influenced by local Canaanite ways, rather than a clear import from an Egyptian background following a mass migration.
And those numbers in Exodus, 600,000 men, plus women and children, that's always seemed, well,
It's
enormous.
staggering. You're talking potentially over 2 million people in total.
Which raises questions about,
About everything, really. Could Egypt's population at the time even support losing that many people? Could the Sinai Desert sustain that number for decades? Logistically, it's incredibly difficult to imagine.
and you'd think an event that big, plagues and all, would leave some mark in Egyptian records.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? A catastrophe on that scale, the loss of a massive workforce, the destruction of an army. Yet contemporary Egyptian records are silent on it.
So where does that leave most archaeologists now? Are they saying it just didn't happen as described?
The prevailing view, yes, is that the Exodus story, as told in the Bible, with those huge numbers and specific events, doesn't line up with the archaeological evidence for a single historical event at a specific time.
But that doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened.
Exactly. Some scholars talk about a possible historical core,
Meaning?
meaning maybe a smaller group or several smaller groups did leave Egypt at some point, perhaps escaping hardship or slavery. And over centuries of telling and retelling, maybe through oral tradition, this memory was magnified, theologized, and shaped into the epic story we have in Exodus.
That makes a certain kind of sense. What about parallels? I remember hearing about the Hyksos.
Ah, yes, the Hyksos. They were a Semitic people, foreigners from the East, who actually ruled parts of Egypt for a while, around 1650 down to 1550 BCE.
And then they were kicked out.
Exactly. They were expelled by the Egyptians. So you have this narrative. Semitic people in Egypt rising to prominence, then being driven out. Some scholars see echoes, maybe not a direct link, but potential inspiration or cultural memory feeding into the Exodus story later on.
Interesting. Are there other potential parallels people point to?
Yeah, though they're maybe a bit more speculative, some have looked at Akhenaten's religious revolution, that brief flirtation with monotheism in Egypt.
Okay.
Others point to the Habiru, mentioned in various ancient Near Eastern texts. They were often seen as outsiders, wanderers, sometimes mercenaries or disruptive elements. Maybe some Israelites were part of groups like that.
And the Sea Peoples.
Yeah, the migrations and disruptions caused by the Sea Peoples around the end of the Bronze Age, that's another context people look at. The Egyptologist Jan Assmann, for example, has argued that the Exodus narrative might be a kind of composite memory, blending different historical experiences into one powerful story, even if it's not historically accurate in every single detail.
Okay, so the history is clearly complex and debated. Let's pivot then. What's the purpose of the book? What are the big themes it's trying to get across?
Well, on the surface, the most obvious purpose is to tell the story of Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt. It's their national founding story, right? A testament to God stepping in.
Their origin story, in a way.
Exactly. But beneath that, there's a much deeper theological purpose going on.
Would you?
It's really about God revealing himself, specifically as Yahweh. Remember that crucial moment with the burning bush, the declaration, Yehei Asher Ehei, I am who I am?
Right.
The whole narrative, in many ways, is an answer to Pharaoh's challenge early on.
Hmm.
Who is the Lord Yahweh that I should obey him?
So the plagues weren't just punishment.
From a theological perspective in the text, no. They were demonstrations, God making his power known. Exodus explicitly says God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he could show his power, so his name would be proclaimed through all the earth. It was for Egypt, for Israel, for everyone.
And that revelation continues after they leave Egypt.
Absolutely. The journey through the wilderness isn't just about travel. It's about God teaching Israel who he's providing food, water, protection, leading them, building that relationship.
Culminating at Mount Sinai.
Right. The covenant,
Yeah.
the giving of the law, the 10 Commandments. And significantly, how does the first commandment start? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. It all ties back.
So if we were to list the key themes running through Exodus.
Okay, well, definitely redemption, God rescuing his people from bondage. That's huge.
Yeah.
And covenant, the sacred agreement between God and Israel. It's conditional, too, based on obedience.
She leads to.
Divine law and obedience. Exodus gives us the first big block of God's instructions for how to live as his people.
Okay.
What else? We also see God's complex nature. He's demanding. He expects holiness. There's judgment. Think of the golden calf incident.
Right.
But he's also incredibly merciful and forgiving. Exodus 33 and 34, after the calf, show God relenting and reaffirming his presence.
And the importance of names seems key, too.
Yes. God revealing his personal name, Yahweh, to Moses. That's massive. It signals intimacy, uniqueness, God's own being. And that leads into that amazing self-description God gives in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7.
Remind us of that one.
It's foundational.
Yeah.
The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. That passage echoes throughout the rest of the Bible. It's a touchstone for understanding God's character.
Wow. Okay. So powerful themes. Let's get back to some of those dramatic events, specifically the 10 plagues. They're presented as divine interventions, clearly, but are there natural explanations people have proposed? What do the sources say?
It's really fascinating, actually. There's been a lot of speculation trying to link the plagues to natural phenomena, maybe in a kind of chain reaction.
Like dominoes falling?
Sort of. For the Nile turning to blood, one common theory is a red algal bloom, something like oscillatory erubescence.
Which would do what?
It could turn the water reddish, kill fish by depleting oxygen, and make the water toxic, undrinkable. Plausible? Maybe.
And the frogs?
Well, if the water's bad and the fish are dead, the frogs would be forced onto land in massive numbers. You could get something that looks like a plague of frogs.
Okay, plausible domino effect so far.
Right.
What about the lice or gnats?
Dead frogs rotting everywhere, perfect breeding ground for insects, lice, fleas, gnats, a population explosion. Some even link this to transmitting diseases later on.
Like the boils. But before that, the wild beasts or flies. That one's always seemed a bit vague.
It is vague in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
Could be wild animals driven closer to humans due to ecological disruption, or maybe specifically biting insects like stable flies. If it was stable flies, some theories connect them to spreading diseases that cause boils or affect livestock.
And the livestock disease itself.
Yeah, the plague on livestock. The description sounds awfully similar to rinderpest.
Rinder?
Yeah, a devastating viral disease in cattle. Highly contagious, high mortality. It's caused massive die-offs historically. So again, a possible natural explanation fits there.
Okay, and the boils on humans.
Could be various things. Maybe an outbreak of something like smallpox, or maybe skin infections like Staphylococcus aureus, potentially spread by those flies we mentioned, or just poor sanitation in a time of crisis.
Then comes the fiery hail. That sounds pretty dramatic.
Very. One of the most popular, though debated theories links this and maybe other plagues to a massive volcanic eruption, specifically the eruption of Serra Santorini in the Aegean.
Santorini. But that's quite far from Egypt.
It is, but it was a colossal eruption, one of the biggest in human history, likely around the 16th or maybe even 15th century BC, which could overlap with the early Exodus dating.
And how would that cause fiery hail?
The idea is volcanic ash, high in the atmosphere, mixing with thunderstorms, creating unusually severe storms with hail, maybe accompanied by lightning that look like fire.
And could that volcano explain other plagues too?
Potentially. The locusts, for example. Volcanic ashfall can mess with weather patterns, maybe cause unusual rainfall and humidity downstream, which could create ideal breeding conditions for locust swarms.
Okay. What about the darkness?
That's often linked to the volcano, too, a massive ash cloud blocking out the sun for days. Or, alternatively, some propose a particularly long and intense Khamsin dust storm, which are known in Egypt. A solar eclipse has also been suggested, but the timing matching a specific eclipse is tricky.
Right. And then the final terrible plague, the death of the firstborn. Any natural theories for that?
This is perhaps the hardest to explain naturally, but one theory involves mycotoxins.
Fungus.
Sort of. Toxins produced by mold growing on stored grain, especially if it got damp maybe from the previous plague's disruptions. The idea, and it's speculative, is that the firstborn, often having preferential status, might have eaten stored grain first, or maybe grain stored higher up where mold could grow, and thus ingested lethal doses of toxins that others didn't.
Wow. That's a chilling thought.
It is. And of course, the Passover ritual is presented as the way the Israelites were spared this, marking their doors so the destroyer would pass over them. It commemorates God's judgment and mercy.
And after the plagues, the escape, the parting of the Red Sea, how is that viewed?
Well, in the narrative, It's the ultimate miracle, right?
Yeah.
God parting the waters for Israel and closing them on Pharaoh's army.
Have people tried to explain that naturally, too?
Yes, there are wind set-down theories. The idea that a very strong, sustained wind could potentially push back shallow waters in certain areas, like the marshy lakes north of the Red Sea proper, creating temporary dry ground.
Plausible.
It's physically possible under specific conditions, but whether it matches the timing and the dramatic description in Exodus walls of water, the specific timing of the waters returning, that's highly debated. Many see it purely as a supernatural event within the story.
And even after all that, the Israelites start complaining in the desert.
Yeah, Exodus 16 to 18, the grumbling about food and water. It's such a human part of the story, isn't it? Even after witnessing apparent miracles, fear and basic needs take over. It really tests their faith, questions God's provision despite the manna and water he provides.
Then comes Sinai, the Ten Commandments.
Foundational. Whether you view it as direct divine dictation or a codification of existing moral law, its impact on ethics and law in Western culture is undeniable, given as part of that covenant relationship.
And immediately followed by the golden calf disaster.
Right. A stark reminder of human weakness, the pull of idolatry, and a breach of that brand new covenant. But it also leads into that profound moment of God's mercy and reaffirmation we mentioned earlier from Exodus 34. Shows both justice and forgiveness.
So bringing all these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive on Exodus, what are the really key things for you, our listener, to take away?
I think the main thing is recognizing Exodus as this incredibly rich, layered narrative. It works on so many levels. There's a powerful theological message about God, redemption, covenant. There's the historical dimension, which is complex and debated, with that gap between the grand story and the archaeological record.
Right.
And then there are these intriguing possibilities of natural phenomena perhaps playing a role, or at least influencing how the story was told or remembered.
So it's not necessarily an either situation, faith versus history versus science.
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
And regardless of where you land on the historical questions, its power as a foundational story is just undeniable. For identity, for faith traditions, for liberation movements throughout history, its influence is immense.
It really has echoed down through the centuries.
Absolutely. It shaped Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and even secular thought about freedom and justice. It continues to be a story people turn to.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. How does understanding these different layers, the faith aspect, the historical questions, the potential natural explanations change or enrich how you view Exodus? What does it mean for such a profoundly influential story, one carrying such deep symbolic truth, to also have a historical background that remains so actively debated and explored? Something definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.